Loneliness and depression can strike at any time, not just for humans, but for animals as well. They're cruel emotions that cause a sadness that can seem like it will never go away. For 10 years, a goat named Mr. G and a donkey named Jelly Bean had been living on a farm owned by an animal hoarder. Thankfully, the two were eventually rescued from the farm and brought to separate facilities to care for them. After arriving at his new home at the sanctuary, Mr. G didn't eat or go outside for 6 days. He was completely despondent. The staff at the sanctuary knew they had to do something quickly to save his life. And what happened next was amazing. Animals can form close bonds with each other, and when those bonds are severed, the animals can, much like humans, slip into a depression. A goat named Mr. G was rescued from an animal hoarder's farm along with a donkey named Jelly Bean, with whom he'd become close. Unfortunately, the two were sent to different sanctuaries, and it seemed as if Mr. G would never see his best friend again. Whereas most of the animals rescued by the California-based Animal Place were ecstatic about their newfound freedom, Mr. G found it difficult to acclimate. The staff noticed that he just couldn't shake that feeling of loneliness. Mr. G spent nearly 10 years being neglected in his former home. Though he was clearly traumatized by the abuse, he'd always had Jelly Bean to keep him company. Now, however, the two were separated and he'd fallen into a deep depression. Although Mr. G was in good health when he arrived at the shelter, he was now so distraught that he simply refused to eat. Shelter workers were concerned that his depression would be the death of him. Night after night, Mr. G cowered in the same corner of his room. He would stare blankly at the walls, and if anyone came in to try to get him up and moving, he wouldn't even acknowledge them. It was heartbreaking to watch. Jeff McCracken, one of the volunteers at the shelter, knew he had to do something to help poor Mr. G. The workers couldn't stand how sad he was acting. The shelter was meant for positive new beginnings, after all. So Jeff jumped in his truck and headed into the hills with an amazing surprise in mind. By day 6 of his stay, Mr. G still hadn't eaten a drop of food. Workers were now extremely concerned he would starve to death. However, around midday, Jeff returned with his truck, and he had something in his trailer he thought would lift Mr. G's spirits. As soon as Mr. G heard Jeff pull into the shelter, his ears perked up. This was the first time in almost a week the goat had responded to any sort of noise or commotion. What exactly was going on outside? Mr. G stood up and slowly went to investigate. Shelter workers were shocked when they saw the small face of Mr. G peeking around the corner of his enclosure's door. It was the first time they'd seen him standing since he arrived. Mr. G took one look around, and then he realized just what Jeff had done for him. Thanks to the efforts of Animal Place and Jeff, Mr. G and Jelly Bean will live happily together for the rest of their lives. Isn't that truly special?